Hi everyone, and welcome to this final lesson in Philosophy 103, Ethics and Society. This last one is the only three-parter. Endless Night Part 3. We are once again going to revisit this idea of moral sentimentalism, and then we'll have some closing comments on ethics itself. But first, we need to reconsider this view. The reason why I have this as the moving image for sentimentalism is because it's all about empathy. It's all about taking the perspective of another. And so I kind of see this as a little bit of a mirror, or something that you can put anything in there. You can put another human in there so that they're the object, they're your cared for other. And so that's why I like this image. It's like a lot of things can go in there, right? So your mom can go in there, or your neighbor can go in there, or whatever. So that's the idea here. And ultimately, the very theory itself, moral sentimentalism as an ethical theory, is itself one gigantic empirical claim. It's basically saying our moral judgments and actions are rooted in our capacity for sympathy. This might be, not typically considered an empirical claim. It doesn't get treated as such, but we can see that that's what it is. It really is the case that they're saying empathy is the driver of moral actions. And so if you ever want to know what you should do in a particular case, you should take the perspective from nowhere and just kind of have this general point of view, this empathic, see what your moral emotions say about this particular action, and then that's how you know whether you should do it or not. Okay, two little caveats here. One, sympathy is what Adam Smith and David Hume called this fundamental moral emotion. We don't call it sympathy anymore. That same idea is more or less what we now call empathy. So that's caveat number one. And caveat number two is that there is plenty of disagreement exactly about how to interpret Smith and Hume. I'm just doing one view, right? If this were a course entirely on these two theorists, then we would take more time, but I'm going to go with a pretty, a well-accepted interpretation of their views. Okay, so there's actually lots of literature on this idea that empathy and, morality are lined up, and it's actually not generally positive for Hume and Smith. So if you're on their camp, you are going to be on the defensive today. Paul Bloom is one psychologist who wrote a whole book saying, well, maybe empathy isn't the way we want to ground our good behavior on. So in Against Empathy, the psychologist Paul Bloom discusses how empathy doesn't necessarily drive you specifically towards moral action, but rather towards the benefit of some cared for other. So in other words, Hume and Smith believe that, if you do the empathic thing, if you do what empathy leads you to do, that will line up with the moral thing, right? They line up. And what Bloom is saying is they sometimes line up and sometimes they don't, right? They go in different directions. And so you have to be careful. Instead, you should engage in what he calls rational compassion. I won't get into that. Let me just clarify how it is that morality can go one way and empathy can take you another way. That's what we're going to focus on today, because that's exactly counter to what we would assume Hume and Smith are telling us. I should add here that this is a very Kantian point. Maybe a better way to put that is that this distinction can only be made thanks to Kant. Kant famously said, well, for an action to have moral worth, it has to be done primarily out of respect for the moral law. So from the slides here, there's a difference between doing something for the sake of some moral principle, that's morality, and doing something for the sake of some cared for other. That's altruism. When you do something for someone else for the sake of them, that's altruism. But when you do something for the sake of abiding by a moral principle out of respect for the moral law, Kant would say, that's moral behavior. So there's altruistic behavior and there's moral behavior. And yeah, sure, they line up a lot. Oftentimes they are going in the same direction, direction of fit, but not always. And we're going to see those cases in a bit. But importantly, only the first is genuine moral behavior. Only the action that is rooted in a moral principle is actual moral behavior. The other is altruistic behavior. So here it is in the slides. The result is that if doing something for a cared for other ever involves breaking a moral principle, then empathy will drive you towards breaking that moral principle for the sake of the cared for other. So this is something that Kant himself considered, and we are now going to look at evidence of this. Here we go. Empirical data time. I know it's your favorite. You love it. Okay. Here are some general tidbits about the research on empathy. First of all, empathy is rather difficult to activate for dissimilar people. In other words, if you have someone before you who is very unlike you, you're going to have a hard time activating your empathy for them. Now, activating in scare quotes here, right? But the general idea is that it doesn't come naturally all the time. It does come very naturally if someone is very much like us. But besides that, it's quite difficult. So if you're relying on empathy to produce your good behaviors, you're not always going to be good because, you're basically going to be good in a very biased way, only towards those that you can activate, your empathy for, people that are very much like you. Okay, so that's one issue, but it's also hard to get some empathy going in other domains. Like there's various important moral issues that you can't really get empathy going for. So here on the slides, I have global warming, resource overconsumption, global poverty, homelessness. If you look at things on a macro scale, where you don't visualize, you don't actively visualize a human being there suffering, then it's really hard to feel empathy for that. You can feel concern, but empathy is something else. When you imagine yourself in the place of another, how are you going to imagine yourself in the place of the planet? You can't. So you might feel concern, but it won't be empathy, and it won't drive you to action like empathy would. Same thing for resource overconsumption. Yeah, you can hear some stats about it, but without really putting yourself in the place of someone, it won't be empathy you're activating. You might feel something, but empathy is a quite unique emotional experience, right? Global poverty, homelessness, you might hear stats about this, but again, it won't be empathy unless you visualize a specific person, in which case you'll feel empathy for them, not for the homelessness problem, right? So it is not clear that you can easily activate empathy in many areas of interest when it comes to ethics. So that's one thing. And by the way, this makes perfect evolutionary sense. That's because empathy evolved to help groups cohere, right? To strengthen our tribe. It didn't evolve to be universally felt about everyone. So empathy basically makes our interactions with others a little more seamless. It makes you do, we can call them pro-social things, good things for the group, be cooperative, that kind of thing. Don't lie, don't take more than your fair share. that's what empathy is for. It didn't evolve to feel for everyone. And sure, some people claim you can train yourself to feel it for everyone. Buddhist monks might do this kind of training. And sure, there's interesting findings in that regard, but out of the box, sort of, our empathy doesn't work that way. Our empathy is felt for individuals usually in close proximity to us who are very much like us. That's what it's for. That's why you don't feel empathy for like the planet. You feel concern, but that's not necessarily empathy. There's like a name for this. Researchers have found that empathy is activated primarily by seeing the plight of specific individuals, not by hearing statistics. It's called the identifiable victim effect, right? I could give you stats on like, if you give $100, you will save 25 families and blah, 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 blah. But that won't get your empathy going like me showing you an individual person in a photo and telling you about them so that you can try to feel what they feel. That's what gets people to feel empathy, and that's what gets people to act. So you need someone to visualize, to put yourself in the place of, to feel empathy, to get all those benefits of feeling empathy, meaning all those ethical benefits. Okay, well, so in sum, empathy is difficult to activate. It gets worse though. You can actually try to avoid feeling empathy, and people do. So some researchers suggest that maybe people of privilege actively avoid taking the perspective of others and may actively resist putting themselves in situations where they feel empathy. And maybe a lot of us do this, right? So some people are quite good at ignoring homeless people around them. You cross the street, you turn the other way, anything to not feel bad for them so that you don't feel then, because we know what we're going to do if we start feeling empathy. And maybe we don't want to give away money or whatever, do some other good deed. And so basically you try to not feel the empathy so that you don't do the good behavior that comes with it. And some people might be more guilty of it than others, but to a certain extent, maybe we all do. So we can actually push away empathy to get us to not do the good thing. Further, this is maybe the most damning, or although that's arguable, these two last points are highly damning for moral sentimentalism. Further, empathy has been shown to lead to favoritism, giving preference to a cared for other that we feel empathy for. And this obviously violates principles of fairness and justice. So I have this picture here. I don't know why. I know why. Basically, I think a lot of people are familiar with this idea of favoritism among siblings, right? Or cousins or whatever, family members, where one person kind of, they're the favorite, so they always get what they want. That's sort of what's being described here. If you are in a group, and let's just say that you are the manager or whatever, and you feel empathy for one person in particular, you might give them, preference, more preferential tasks when you're assigning, what everyone has to do. So this might lead to, okay, I feel a lot for this person, so I'm going to give them the easiest task, right? I'm gonna give them a raise, whatever, and that might violate, certainly fairness, right? If they're getting the good tasks every single time, that's unfair. And maybe even of justice, right? So if it turns out that they're getting paid more or something like that. And empathy does do this. And there's a paper that I'm citing down there where this has been demonstrated in controlled experiments. So that's not good at all. That's a very good example of where empathy goes one way and morality goes another. If we're being fair, or if we're being moral, we are going to be fair. We're going to abide by the principles of justice. And if we are being empathic or empathetic, then that doesn't always mean follow the moral rules. Sometimes it means whoever you feel for, give them, the good thing. And so that's evidently at odds with morality. Okay. This is the one that I'm maybe thinking is worst of all, right? Question mark. I'm not sure. Empathy might cloud our judgment, leading us to dismiss actions that could lead to greater positive consequences simply because they don't have the same emotional appeal. So many people talk about this, not only Paul Bloom, but also William MacAskill, who wrote a book called Doing Good Better. I think that's what it's called. For example, donating to the Against Malaria Foundation is not terribly emotionally riveting. It's not like, oh yeah, I feel so good about this. Sometimes when let's just say you buy some food for a homeless person, you get kind of a moral buzz, right? You feel good about yourself, like I really did a good thing today. But if you send $20 to the Against Malaria Foundation, you might have saved 20 lives, right? And maybe they'll even tell you that, but it doesn't feel the same way. It doesn't, arouse as much, emotional excitement. The way that one of my colleagues likes to describe this is that it's less sexy. Donating, mosquito nets to people is just less sexy than buying someone food, directly giving it to them. But it might turn out that, giving someone food one time, I mean, that's nice, but in the long run, that won't make a huge difference. But literally, it might be possible that giving some money to the Against Malaria Foundation might save 10, 20 lives, right? Depending on how much you give. I mean, that there is a very direct impact to fighting mosquito-borne illnesses, and that doesn't have the same emotional appeal, so you might not do it because of empathy. Those $20 might have gone to one meal instead of saving 20 lives. And that is, it seems, at least from a utilitarian perspective, seems not good. It seems like the wrong choice. It seems like empathy took you to the least desirable or the lesser of the moral options, maybe. In sum, here are some points against sentimentalism. Empathy can't easily be activated for everyone or for all important moral issues, right? It seems like we can't trust the weight of moral behavior on empathy alone because you can't activate it all the time for everyone or for every issue. So that's one very big point against sentimentalism. You can actually avoid feeling empathy, right? Look the other way. And, you can try to train yourself to do that. And that's bad. That's like amoral training, right? Immoral training, however you want to put it. Training for amorality. But yeah, some people avoid feeling empathy because they don't want to do the good thing. Empathy can lead to favoritism. And that's a very big deal, right? That's when morality goes one way and empathy goes another. And last but not least, empathy might steer us away from behaviors that lead to the most positive consequences, right? If you're a utilitarian, this is bad. You might choose the emotionally appealing action because it feels good. It's a sexy thing to do right now. And even though there's a better option that just has less emotional appeal to it. The point of all that then is empathy and morality can and do dissociate. Thus, they are not fundamentally equivalent and can be at odds with each other if the circumstances are right. That is not great for sentimentalism, who these theorists want to basically rely on empathy for our good behaviors. That's not always gonna actually take us to the moral promised land, right? So unfortunately here, just like with all our other friends, we do say goodbye to moral sentimentalism. Now, I do want to reflect briefly on what it is that happened in this course. It seems like no one theorist survived, and we don't have clear answers on various issues. I want to acknowledge that very quickly. It seems like we're no closer to knowing the true nature of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. We're still at a loss. It's still at a distance. So let's acknowledge that for a second and note that, disagreement more or less characterizes a field of philosophical ethics. I have one researcher here. His name is Nick Bostrom. He works on artificial intelligence and existential threats to humanity. But he mentioned something about ethics that I think is important to acknowledge. Bostrom argues that since there is no ethical theory or meta-ethical position that holds a majority position, that means that most philosophers subscribe to an ethical theory that is false. So let me pause right there. What he's saying is there is no dominant theory in ethics. That is to say, there is no theory where more than half of professional ethicists subscribe to it, right? Kantianism is actually the winner with about a third of ethicists being Kantians, or a third of philosophers, I should say. But that means, let's just pretend that Kantianism is true, and 33% of them philosophers are Kantians. That means that 67% are wrong. 67% wrong? That's a huge number of people being wrong, right? That's systematic error. That's not good. And so we should acknowledge that, right? It seems like, the field is a mess right now. And the reason why that's relevant to Bostrom is that he says ethicists are no help when you're trying to build friendly, in other words, AI that won't hurt us, right? We can't build friendly AI with the help of ethicists because ethicists haven't really figured out how to get what the right thing is. Like, what kind of program should we build into the artificial intelligence so that it's good, so that it's morally good? Ethicists can't help us with that, right? So that's a big problem. Even the people who think there is no objective right and wrong, like the moral skeptics here, who all contributed to this book, they're unsure as to how to proceed once they've accepted that no ethical theory is true. In other words, once these people all agree, hey, you know what? Moral properties, moral rightness, moral wrongness, it's not objectively true. It's made up. They don't know where to go from there. They have some options: conservationism, moral fictionalism, abolitionism. I won't describe what these are. The main point that I want to make here is even the people who see this problem don't know where to go from here. Richard Joyce, who is one of the editors of this edited volume, he goes with fictionalism. Let's just pretend morality is real. Well, which morality, right? The problem still persists. I'm going to go a little bit further here and kind of like maybe blow your mind. I don't know if it's going to blow your mind, but there's actually no clear evidence of moral progress. Now, bear with me here, but okay. Here is Steven Pinker, pretty famous guy. Pinker argues that the decrease in interpersonal violence and warfare over the last few centuries is a byproduct of Enlightenment values. So he basically says, moral philosophy. We have a moral philosophy that has affected the way we behave. Now we don't do all these things that we used to do, like witch burning and human sacrifice. And apparently the French used to set cats on fire because why not? I don't know. But all these horrible, public executions, torture, by and large are gone now. Even when they are done, people hide when they do it because they know it's not okay. So Pinker says it's all thanks to moral philosophy, or in large part thanks to moral philosophy. But some other thinkers believe otherwise. Daniel Immerwahr wrote a book that is actually about American imperialism, but he made an argument in there that is very interesting for our purposes. And so he discusses the motivations behind imperialism. Like, why do countries want to go, conquer other territories? In a word, colonizing countries were after natural resources. That's what they needed, right? And here on the book cover, you can see all these different territories that the U.S. still has to this day that are, Immerwahr would argue, part of the greater empire of the U.S. But in one of his chapters, in chapter 16, he explains why the U.S. actually gave up some of its colonies, right? So colonizing countries wanted natural resources, and so that kind of makes sense. And then in the 20th century, in the middle of the 20th century, the U.S. started giving up colonies. And that seems like moral progress, right? It seems like, oh yeah, colonialism bad, and we give up our colonies, and that's good. But Immerwahr says that's only the appearance of good. I wrote here on the slides, ostensibly morally good, meaning it looks like it's good, but it's not actually good. And so I'm going to show you what that means. Again, I'm making this from a Kantian standpoint. I'm saying if you're doing something good, it's only morally good if you do it out of moral principle. That's the key. So let me tell you Immerwahr's story real quick. So one of the most important resources was rubber. All right. It only grows 10 degrees from the equator. This is why Japan sought various regions of the Pacific during its imperial era. Once Japan conquered these territories, the U.S. suffered a very real rubber shortage. If you don't know this, you need rubber for everything. Without literally tons of rubber, you don't get ships, you don't get, cars require tires, which contain rubber. There's rubber in clothes, more than you think. So it's actually quite an essential resource. And that's why Japan grabbed all these colonies, all these colonies during World War II, or leading up to World War II as well, because they needed this rubber. A speed limit of 35 miles per hour was instituted to prolong the longevity of the tires on the mainland USA, and FDR even warned citizens that it might be necessary to confiscate civilian tires for military use. Obviously, the U.S. felt this pinch. They needed the rubber. So they actually slowed down everyone. They're like, you got to conserve your tires, right? So you're going to drive slower now. And we might have to take your tires eventually because we might need them for the war effort. So this was a very, very real need for rubber. So essential for empire were natural resources that Immerwahr makes the case that Germany used risky blitzkrieg, all-or-nothing tactics, due to their short supply of rubber. He also reminds us that most German troop movements between battles were done by horse. So another imperialistic country, Germany, Nazi Germany, during this time period, they might have been forced to engage in these risky tactics, the famous lightning war, the blitzkrieg, because they just had such little rubber. And in fact, in between their tank battles, they would move around on horse, which shows you that it really was an issue, right? All these shortage of natural resources were sort of driving the policy. Okay, well, here is now the punchline. But the U.S. dropped its need for colonies through the synthetic procurement of its essential resources. It started with rubber. Through hundreds of tiny discoveries, the U.S. was eventually able to produce synthetic rubber made mostly from oil. So once there is, what is that saying? Need, invention, something about inventions and need. Need is the mother of all invention. Yeah. So once that was, the shortages were being felt by the U.S., the race was on. They needed to make, synthetic rubber and everything else that they needed, all the other natural resources. And they did. They had various, the way Immerwahr makes it seem is like lots of little discoveries cumulatively led to, basically a revolution in being able to produce your own natural resources. Eventually, the U.S. could synthetically produce silk, hemp, jute, which I'm not even sure what it is, camphor, cotton, wool, pyrethrum, don't know what that is either, gutta percha, tin, copper, tung oil, and more. All these things, I'm sure, are essential for something. And it's not only for war making, but also for just everyday needs, right? I know that cotton is in a surprising amount of things. I'm under the impression that all kinds of plastics appear where you might not expect them, right? So, these things are necessary, and the ability to produce them cheaply and synthetically without having to have colonies was very, very good. And so, this, along with national militant anti-imperialist movements worldwide, simultaneously explains why colonialism, by and large, ended in the second half of the 20th century, as well as why the only places that are still having problems with foreign invaders are places with natural oil reserves. Ethics had nothing to do with it, says Immerwahr. The reason why countries dropped their colonies, well, for one, maybe they couldn't afford them anymore. But in many cases, in particular in the case of the US, they just didn't need them anymore. So it's not moral improvement. It's not realizing that colonialism is wrong. It's just bullets and science. It's like, well, we got people fighting. So, for example, in Vietnam, there was a nationalist, a militant, anti-imperialist movement fighting, first the French, then the Americans. And, that people don't like that. Basically, it was costing people elections. So those bullets were one reason for dropping the colonies. And the other is that you didn't need colonies for what you typically use colonies for, natural resources. And again, the main point here is morality didn't play, I was going to say first, a large role, but if you believe this story, it didn't play any role. So bullets and science, that's enough for getting rid of bad things like colonialism. And that doesn't look good for ethics, right? So I got one more bit for you here. There's literally no evidence that studying ethics makes you a more ethical person. Now that makes me sad because I definitely did love this show, right? I don't know if you never watched it, please watch The Good Place. But Eric Schwitzgebel, who's over, I think, at UC Riverside, has been compiling all this evidence that shows that ethicists don't behave any better than the regular Joe, right? Sometimes they behave worse. And so there is something kind of confusing here. So the point of all this is I acknowledge this course is a little weird, right? At the end of it, it's like, what did we really learn? Maybe you unlearned some things, and that's a good thing, actually. But it seems like ethics is a mess, and I want to first admit that that is true. Ethics is a mess. Nonetheless, here's how I want to close this class. We've been looking for explanations as to why some things are morally right or morally wrong. And yes, at that level, tons of disagreement. Basically, trench warfare, right? It's the utilitarians here, the Kantians here, right? And they're never going to move, that kind of thing. Philosophical trench warfare is what I would call it. I agree. It looks bad. But at the surface level, right, if you go above that a little bit, the waters today are much calmer. There's actually substantial agreement on many, many things, right? Ethicists tend to write mostly about the things they disagree about because that's where the action happens, but they agree on a ton. basically everyone says, if you can, you should donate more. A lot of us don't really donate even minimally, right? It seems like a lot of us can spare a little bit more for others. And it's not only money. Donate your time. Sometimes your emotional labor is what you can donate. So there's a lot we can do to help others. And a lot of us aren't doing much of anything right now. So that is one thing where we can all possibly improve on. More money, more time with others, more emotional labor, help others more, be more compassionate. That's one thing that ethicists agree on. Another has to do with our consumption. So here I'm focusing on our food consumption, and it seems like there's definitely room for improvement when it comes to animal agriculture. So that's just one thing. But consumption in general, we seem to buy things that we don't need all the time, and this affects the environment. We create trash, we don't recycle. All these things seem to be problematic, and ethicists basically say, hey, we gotta work on that too. That's not good either, right? So there's another issue that ethicists agree on. Ask any ethicist, and unfair practices are not okay. Prejudice is not okay. Certainly when it leads to, unequitable distribution of opportunity and resources and all that. So we can work on that as well, right? Get rid of unfairness wherever we see it. And I have one more for you, right? Every ethicist agrees, even though they're not clear on what the best approach is, but we really ought to take better care of our planet. It does seem that, this is our one shot, and if we don't take good care of it, well, then that might be it for us. So that's what I want to close on. All of us can do a little something to make the world better.